Asterisk. In the year 213 BC, Rome faced not just an enemy, but a mind. On the shores of Sicily, in the city of Syracuse, the fate of an empire would be tested not by swords or ships, but by the imagination of one man, Archimedes. With mathematics as his weapon and invention as his shield, he built machines that could hurl ships into the air, crush men like insects, and even set the sea itself on fire. For Rome, it would become one of their hardest battles. For history, it would become a story of genius against empire. Asterisk 1. A city between giants, the Second Punic War was tearing the Mediterranean apart. Hannibal had crossed the Alps into Italy. Carthage fought Rome tooth and nail, and every city was forced to choose sides. For decades, Syracuse had stood as a loyal ally of Rome. Its king, Hiero, too, was a man of wisdom and restraint. He kept his city safe by balancing alliances carefully, maintaining peace between Syracuse and the Republic. As long as Hiero lived, the Roman flag flew high over Sicily. But in 215 BC, Hiero died, and with him died the delicate balance that had preserved peace. His heir, Hieronymus, was barely 15 years old, a boy king on a throne of fire. Young, inexperienced, and seduced by promises of power, he abandoned Rome and leaned toward Carthage. The city that had once been a bastion of Roman friendship now risked becoming a dagger pointed at Rome's back. For the Romans, the betrayal was intolerable. It was the crown of Sicily, a jewel of trade, wealth, and strategic position. If Syracuse turned fully to Carthage, the entire island, perhaps the entire war, could be lost. And so Rome prepared for war. The Senate appointed Marcus Claudius Marcellus, one of its most seasoned commanders, to bring Syracuse to heel. But what Rome did not yet understand was that this would not be a simple siege. Syracuse had a secret weapon, not a fleet, not an army, but a man. In the workshops of Syracuse worked Archimedes, mathematician, inventor, and visionary. To him, numbers were not abstract. They were forces of nature. Leverage, angles, the power of a curve, these were weapons as real as swords. When Archimedes turned his genius to war, the walls of Syracuse became more than stone. They became a living fortress, bristling with engines of terror. For the first time, Rome would not fight flesh and blood alone. They would fight mathematics. And so began the most unusual battle Rome had ever faced, a clash not only of armies and empires, but of brilliance against persistence. 2. Archimedes turns genius into weapons. The Roman fleet appeared on the horizon like a wall of iron. 60 quinquiremes, massive warships, rowed by hundreds of men, their decks bristling with soldiers ready to storm the walls of Syracuse. To any other city, it would have been a sight of terror, a storm no stone wall could withstand. To the citizens, he was already a legend, a man who could draw circles in the sand and uncover secrets of the universe. But now, with Rome at the gates, his chalk lines became blueprints of war. Archimedes did not see walls and ships as separate things. He saw levers, pulleys, weights, trajectories, numbers, waiting to be harnessed. He turned his city into a laboratory of terror. First came the catapults. Not one, not two, but an array of them, each carefully calibrated for different ranges. Smaller ones launched volleys of stones and darts at ships still far out at sea. Larger ones hurled boulders the size of oxen, smashing hulls and crushing men where they stood. Rome's soldiers watched in disbelief as their mighty ships splintered under a rain of geometry-made steel. Then came the ballistae, giant crossbows mounted on towers, firing bolts thick as tree trunks. They punched through shields, skewered lines of men, and sent entire boarding parties tumbling into the sea. Every approach, every tactic Rome had rehearsed was shattered by weapons no other city in the world possessed. And then there was the most terrifying invention of all. The claw of Archimedes. Mounted along the walls, hidden from sight, were massive cranes armed with iron hooks and chains. As Roman ships drew close, these claws reached down, seized their hulls, and, with a groan of gears and counterweights, lifted them out of the water. The ships tipped violently, their crews screaming as they capsized, crashing back into the waves or shattering against the rocks. Some were dropped upright, only to be smashed moments later. To the Romans, it was as if the very sea had grown hands to tear them apart. Stories spread like wildfire through the Roman ranks. Men whispered of another weapon, mirrors of polished bronze that caught the sun and focused its rays on ships, setting sails ablaze. Whether myth or truth, it did not matter. Fear itself became one of Archimedes' inventions. For every Roman sailor who rowed toward Syracuse, it was no longer a battle. It was a nightmare. They were not fighting men. They were fighting the mind of a single genius who seemed to command the laws of nature. And above it all, Archimedes remained calm. To him, it was not cruelty. It was calculation. He had turned numbers into arrows, geometry into fire, and the brilliance of the human mind into Rome's greatest obstacle. 3. The long siege. Rome had fought many enemies before Hannibal with his elephants, the Gauls with their fury, the Carthaginians with their fleets. But never had they faced a single man who could stop an entire army. And that is what Archimedes had become, a one-man wall between Rome and Syracuse. Every time the Romans attacked, they were thrown back. Siege towers toppled before they reached the walls. Ladders snapped as boulders rained down. Ships were smashed, burned, or dragged into the depths by machines no one had ever seen before. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, Rome's commander, was no fool. He was a veteran of countless campaigns, a man who had faced Hannibal himself. Yet here, against one city and one mind, he found himself powerless. The longer he fought, the more his soldiers whispered, "We are not at war with Syracuse. We are at war with Archimedes." But Marcellus understood something Archimedes could not. Machines could kill men, but they could not feed a city. War was not only fought with weapons, it was fought with time. So Rome changed its strategy. No longer would they hurl men at the walls. Instead, they would surround Syracuse, cut off its ports, choke its supply lines, and wait. The siege dragged on. Weeks turned into months. The proud city that once mocked Rome from its walls now grew restless. Food ran low. Grain shipments dwindled. Carthage, their supposed ally, was too preoccupied to send help. Inside Syracuse, political factions tore at each other. Some still clung to Carthage, others whispered about surrender to Rome. Meanwhile, Archimedes' machines stood silent more often. Not because they had failed, they had worked perfectly. Because the enemy no longer dared approach the walls. The genius of Archimedes had bought time, but time was exactly what Rome wanted. For the citizens of Syracuse, the war became a slow suffocation. Hunger gnawed, tempers flared, and the promise of Carthaginian salvation grew dimmer each day. The very brilliance that had saved them from Rome's swords could not save them from Rome's patience. Marcellus watched, waited, and tightened his grip. His soldiers no longer feared Archimedes' inventions because they no longer had to face them. It was not courage that would take Syracuse, but endurance. And so the once proud city stood trapped, a fortress bristling with weapons of genius, yet helpless before the most ancient weapon of all time. For the fall of Syracuse by 212 BC, the great city of Syracuse was weary. Hunger gnawed at its people, factions quarreled in its streets, and the promise of Carthaginian rescue had faded into silence. The walls still stood. Archimedes' machines still waited. But inside, the city's spirit was breaking, and Rome was watching. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, ever patient, waited for the moment when vigilance would falter. He knew that no city could celebrate forever while starving under siege. And then, one night, the opportunity came. The Syracusans were deep in celebration, honoring the goddess Artemis. Music, wine, and ritual filled the streets. Guards grew lax. Torches flickered low. Atop the walls, watchmen turned their eyes from the horizon to the festival within. In the shadows, a Roman assault team crept forward. Scaling ladders, silent and swift, they climbed the unguarded sections of the wall. Within minutes, they had overpowered the few sentries who remained and opened the gates. Rome poured in like a flood. The city that had resisted with genius and fire fell not to battle, but to a moment of human weakness. Soldiers stormed through the streets. Doors were broken. Families fled. The proud fortress that had once mocked Rome was undone by its own distraction, and in that chaos, tragedy struck. Archimedes, the man who had terrified Rome, the mind that had turned mathematics into war, remained in his home. He was said to be bent over his work, drawing figures in the sand, lost in thought even as the city collapsed around him. Marcellus had given strict orders. Archimedes was to be spared. He wanted the genius alive to serve Rome as he had served Syracuse. But war is not precise. In the frenzy of looting, a Roman soldier burst into Archimedes' house. Whether out of fear, anger, or ignorance, he struck the old man down. Just like that, a flame of brilliance was extinguished not by strategy, but by a single sword in the hands of an impatient soldier. When Marcellus learned what had happened, he grieved. He had won Syracuse, but lost Archimedes. Victory felt hollow. The machines of genius were silent, their master gone forever. The fall of Syracuse was complete. Rome had triumphed, but not through courage or invention. It had triumphed through endurance, through patience, and through the inevitability of hunger. And yet, in that victory, Rome revealed its own truth. It could break walls, but it could not conquer genius. For though Archimedes lay dead, his name would live longer than any general's, longer even than the city itself. Syracuse was silent. Its streets, once filled with music, philosophy, and invention, now echoed only with the boots of Roman soldiers. The city's treasures were carried away, its temples plundered, its people enslaved. For Rome, it was a victory. But for history, it was something else entirely. The death of Archimedes left a wound that no triumph could heal. Marcellus, the Roman general who had ordered him spared, lamented deeply. He knew what had been lost. Rome could conquer armies, raise cities, and silence nations, but it could not replace the mind of Archimedes. And so, while Syracuse became another jewel in Rome's crown, Archimedes became something more, a legend. The stories of his machines spread through the empire. Soldiers who had watched ships torn from the sea swore that he commanded the gods. Mariners spoke of mirrors that set sails ablaze with fire from the sun. Whether myth or truth, it did not matter. Archimedes' genius had entered the realm of legend, where fear and wonder intertwine. Rome had won the war, but the world remembered the man. Even centuries later, generals and kings studied his inventions. Engineers tried to replicate his weapons. Mathematicians built upon his discoveries. And long after the names of Syracuse's rulers faded into dust, The name Archimedes still stood, written in the stars of history. The Siege of Syracuse became a lesson carved into time, that empires may endure by discipline, armies by strength, and cities by stone, but the human mind endures by imagination. And sometimes one mind can hold back an empire. For the Romans, it was their hardest victory. For Archimedes, it was his final stand. For us, it is a reminder that power comes not only from legions and weapons, but from the spark of thought, the curve of an idea, the brilliance of a question asked in the sand. Rome claimed Syracuse, but Archimedes claimed eternity. Archimedes may have died that day, but his genius lives on not in walls or weapons, but in every discovery that changes the world. If this story fascinated you, don't let it end here. Hit like, share this video with those who love history, and subscribe to Empire Unveiled Legends, because the myths hide truths, and the truths of history are often more incredible than legend. Asterisk.